Now to end this video, let's take a look at the actual requests and responses in the browser. In this video, I want to give you an overview of how Laravel Sanctum API authentication works. We'll be taking a look at the entire flow, starting with acquiring the CSRF cookie, logging the user in, performing an action as an authenticated user, and we'll end up with the user being logged out due to inactivity. The reason I want to do this is because once you understand how everything works, it's much easier to debug any kind of issues you might face. Now, our journey starts with the SPA, which I will represent with this vertical rectangle. So this right here is our SPA living under app.com. On the right side, we'll have our Laravel API, which will live under api.app.com. So it will live under a subdomain. Now, Laravel has what I like to call layers of protection, and there are 3 of them. I'll start adding them from the outside in. So this will be our first layer of protection. Let's make it a bit different. It'll be like a dashed red. And this first layer of protection is the coarse layer. The coarse layer allows your server to specify what origins are allowed to send in cross-origin requests. In our case, app.com should definitely be on the list of allowed origins, otherwise we'll be getting coarse-related errors in our console. Moving on to the second layer, I'll make this one, let's say green. The second layer is the verify CSRF token middleware. And this one helps with preventing bad actors from engineering pages that trick users of your application into sending unwanted requests to your server. And finally, our third layer. Let's make this one maybe blue. This layer is the Sanctum middleware, the ensure front-end requests are stateful middleware. And this layer doesn't actually do any protection, at least not directly. Its role is to authenticate requests coming from recognized domains, domains that are part of the Sanctum stateful domains list. App.com should be on that list, otherwise your SPA will always receive 401 unauthenticated responses. Now, inside all this, we'll have our API. Well, technically this entire thing is the Laravel API, but this will be where we end up after going through all the layers of protection. Let's make this solid white. Now, this is our SPA, this is the Laravel API. In order to log in, a session must be established. And to do that, we need to send an initial request. Where we send this request doesn't really matter, we just need to hit the server. As a convenience, we have the Sanctum CSRF cookie endpoint. But again, this doesn't really matter, it could be any other endpoint. We just need an initial request. However, the way browsers work is, before sending a cross-origin request, which we are doing here because app.com is different than api.app.com, a pre-flight request is being sent first. This will be our pre-flight request. And the goal of this request is basically to ask the server if the SPA is allowed to send this GET request. The server then responds with a series of access, control, allow headers. And these headers tell the browser whether or not the request will be accepted. And if that's the case and course is properly configured to allow requests from app.com, our request goes past the course layer to the next layer. Now this verify CSRF token middleware is only concerned with post, put, patch, and delete requests. And since we are using a GET request, we move on to the next layer. Here, the ensure frontend requests are stateful middleware will only try to authenticate the request. It does not stop it or reject it or anything, it only tries and sees if there is any associated user with the request. So we're allowed to move on. Now, once we reach the inner circle, or rectangle in this case, a session will be created on the server. That session will have an ID, let's say 123, and a CSRF token. Then, in the response sent back to the server, the CSRF token and the session ID will be sent back as cookies, which expire in 2 hours. And here, the browser will take those cookies and save them. So we'll have CSRF, or ID, session ID, 123, and CSRF ABC. So right now, there's no user authentication, no nothing. We just have a session on the server and session information in the browser. To authenticate the user, we'll have to send another request. This time, the request will be sent to, it will be a post request sent to the /login endpoint with the email and password. And not only this, we'll also have to include the X CSRF token header, which has the value of our CSRF cookie, so ABC. And not only that, the browser will also include the session ID cookie as part of the request. It does this automatically. Assuming the course layer is properly configured, we'll be able to go past it and reach the verify CSRF token middleware. Now this middleware will apply in this scenario because we are using a post request. And the way it works is Laravel will read the session ID and try to find the associated session on the server. Then it will grab the CSRF token here and compare it with the value we sent in our X CSRF token header. If those two values don't match, Laravel will return a 419 token mismatch response. If they do match, the request will be allowed to move forward. Here, the ensure frontend requests are stateful middleware will again take the session ID, find the associated session, and see if there's an user ID here. And since it's not, this request is not authenticated, but again, it will allow it to go through. Once we reach the server, Laravel will find the user matching the email and the password. So say we have a user with an ID of 1, email and password. And not only that, it will also update the existing session with the user ID. So here we'll also have the user ID. And then of course, it will return back a response with the CSRF token and session ID cookies, valid for 2 hours. At this point, our user is authenticated and they have 2 hours to send in the next request. Otherwise, their session will expire. Now let's assume we want to make a request to a protected route. A route requiring authentication. So I'm going to add another rectangle, and this right here, let's set a color to it, maybe purple. And this will be the Sanctum, the Auth Sanctum middleware. So anything inside this rectangle will require an authenticated user. And let's say our SPA wants to get the currently authenticated user. So it will make a request, a GET request to API/user. Again, the browser will automatically include the session ID cookie. And we may choose to send in the CSRF token header. Now, assuming course is properly configured, we'll get past this layer to the verify CSRF token middleware which is only concerned with post, put, patch, and delete requests. And since our request it's a GET request, we'll easily go past that protection layer as well. Now, once we hit the ensure frontend requests are stateful middleware, if Sanctum is properly configured, meaning that app.com is part of the Sanctum stateful domains list, Laravel will take the session ID, find the corresponding session on the server, see the user ID, and load the user, essentially authenticating our request. So by the time we hit this rectangle, we already have a user attached to the request, meaning that once we get to the Auth Sanctum middleware, which checks if the user is authenticated, we'll be able to access whatever we want to access, in our case, the API/user route. Then the response we get back will contain the user details, as well as the CSRF and session ID cookies, which will be valid for another 2 hours. But then again, after a while, specifically after 2 hours, the cookies we had in our browser will expire. So we no longer have the session ID and CSRF cookie. That means if our SPA will make the same request, so get/API/user, we'll no longer have a session ID cookie, which means we'll manage to get past the course layer because app.com will be allowed to make requests to api.app.com. So we get past this layer. This is a GET request, so we'll make it past the verify CSRF token layer as well. And we'll reach the ensure frontend requests are stateful middleware, which will try to authenticate the user, but since there is no session ID to match the session on the server, the request will have no user attached to it, which means when we'll reach the Auth Sanctum middleware, Laravel will return us a 401 unauthenticated response because we have no user attached to the request. And this is how Laravel Sanctum SPA authentication works in a nutshell. Now to end this video, let's take a look at the actual requests and responses in the browser. Once I click the login button, a couple requests are made. The first one is the Sanctum CSRF cookie request, and this is our initial contact with the Laravel API. Its job is to create a session on the server and return the cookies indicating the ID of the created session and the CSRF token. Now to make sure these cookies were actually set, not just received, we can go to Application, Cookies, and here they are. Next up, we have a pre-flight request to the login endpoint. And the goal of this pre-flight request is to ask the Laravel API if we can make our actual login request. And the server responds with these access control allow type of headers. We have allow credentials set to true, which means we can send cookies back and forth. Allow headers, we can send the content type and CSRF token header. We can make a post request from this origin, which is our SPA address. And then we have max age 0, which indicates for how long are these permissions valid. So this request basically gets us past the course layer. And then we have our actual login request that sends in the credentials along with, if we look at the request headers, we have the cookie header, which is automatically included by the browser, that has the CSRF token and most importantly, the Laravel session ID. This session ID will be used to find the actual session on the server and then compare the CSRF token from that session with the XCSRF token header we are sending. If they don't match, we get back a 419 token mismatch response. Otherwise, the request moves forward. Laravel finds the user matching the email and password and updates the session with the user ID, essentially turning us into an authenticated user. Next up, we have another pre-flight request, this time to API/user, and it's the same story. We receive these access control allow type of headers that basically gets us past the course layer, so we can send our actual API user request. Here, if we look at the request headers, again, we are sending our cookies, which includes the Laravel session ID, which is used to find the associated session on the server. And since that session has a user ID inside it, Laravel knows who we are and grabs the user from the database. Now, after a period of inactivity, our Laravel session cookie will expire. And when that happens, if we are trying to make a request to a protected endpoint, like this get user here, since we no longer have a session ID, Laravel won't be able to find our session on the server, so it will send us a 401 unauthorized response. And that was the Laravel Sanctum SPA authentication overview. If you found this video useful, don't forget to like it, share it, subscribe, click the bell button, all that good stuff. Bye!